Hi, good morning, and welcome to the ZP Developer Zone. So every week at 8 a.m. UK time, we do a sort of webinar specifically for the members of our ZP Developer Zone. So this week, I'm going to do a second part really of introducing MIPS, molecular imprinted polymers. But as you can see from the title, there's actually a sort of subdivision of MIPS called molecular imprinted conducting polymers. And so I should really sort of improve my terminology and say that I think at ZP we're particularly interested in molecular imprinted conducting polymers. But let me essentially jump into it a bit and just sort of. So first of all, at ZP, a molecular imprinted polymer and a molecular imprinted conducting polymer sort of in its fabrication, there are really two main parts. There's the electrode, and then there's fabricating the polymer on top of the electrode. So we've started to introduce a series of materials. We call it the MIP backbone, the MIP lock, and the MIP key. And now the idea is that these monomers will get polymerized together to form a polymer. I just want to say hi to Hitcham, who's just joined us online. I know I've got to respond to some of your messages. Just give me the weekend and I will. So nice to see you. So we are talking about molecular imprinted conducting polymers, which is a subdivision of MIPS, molecular imprinted polymers. And I even think that Hitcham, who's online, actually has a background in this as well. And it's something that we're becoming increasingly interested in at ZP as well. Now, this is a very theoretical slide, and it's probably worth saying that we have a video which is linked down below, where it's a bit more practical. But in any kind of sensing application, you'll have a sample that maybe interacts with the sensing layer, and you get a form of signal. And you can look at interactions or those kind of using optical, gravimetric, thermal. But because we are ZP, let's say we're particularly interested in electrochemical. Now, so we want to use molecular imprinted conducting polymers as a sensing layer for electrochemical sensors. Now, I am going to say that I think MIPS and MICPs become really interesting when you start doing it on screen printed electrodes. Now, I think one of the toughest objects to make a MIP for is probably small molecules. And I've used androstenone here as the example. The reason that androstenone might be particularly tough is because it has a certain, has a very specific, has a shape and has chirality about it, but it doesn't have an awful lot of functional groups. Hi Aftab, nice to see you this morning. So we do have, so we would like to, let's say, target molecules like androstenone. Androstenone is a small molecule, and these molecules are particularly tough. And it's because, there's only moderate specificity on these. So there's only a certain number of functional groups on them, so that doesn't make them a bit tougher. Now, talking about conducting polymers, there are many monomers which can be electropolymerized. If you're not sure about electropolymerization, we do have a video on it. The video is a little bit old, but we also have the ZP Academy, and there's a couple of free courses on the ZP Academy that could be useful. I am going to talk rather fast today because today's ZP is actually at a conference called Medica. Medica is a large medical conference in Germany, so I essentially need to get a taxi in a minute. But back to the subject at hand. Conducting polymers can be made from monomers. These monomers can be electropolymerized using techniques like cyclophotometry. If you're not sure about cyclophotometry, then the ZP Academy has some sort of free courses on that. Now, the polymerization of these things can form semiconductors, and you can get specific signals when you bind to these conducting polymers. So let's just take a little bit of a animation through molecular imprinted polymer. So this is a sort of cartoon of a target molecule. Now in the MIPS world, they call it a template. And the idea is you choose a series of monomers which could specifically interact with your template. So the sort of, you choose functional groups that will fit with the functional groups on your target. And then you polymerize a backbone monomer that will essentially stitch all of these together. Now the next process of forming a MIP is actually the extraction. Now you have to get that MIP, so you have to get that template molecule back out of it. And when you've done that, you've created a imprint that should be specific to the target, so i.e. this particular template, and won't bind to the other, let's say, analyte in the solution. So the background from taking MIPs, for me, you've got MIPs, so then you've got molecular imprinted conducting polymers, MICPs, and conducting polymers as an electrochemist are really fairly easy to actually create. You can cyclophotometry is one of the kind of workhorses of electrochemistry, and you can use CV to create the conducting polymers on your electrode. And if you do the polymerization in the presence of the template molecule and these functionalized monomers, then you should be able to create in the first instance, you'll create a MIP where the template is still embedded, and then you have to come up with a technique of extraction, which is kind of interesting because now you're trying to extract a molecule without damaging the original MIP. Now this is a sort of a more functional molecule, and when we look at this particular molecule, I might even ask Hicham if this might be a pesticide. It looks a bit like a pesticide. But what we have here then is a target molecule. It's our template. And we have a couple of functional monomers. These are thiophenes. They're sort of carboxylic acids on thiophenes. And we have... Now, I think the thing about thiophenes is you might have to use organic solvents, so they might not always be the best monomer when thinking about MIPs on screen printed electrodes. But these two monomers interact with the analyte of interest, or in this case we call it the template. They form hydrogen bonds, and then you take a linker molecule, this thiophene, and you electropolymerize it at, for example, 1.4 volts versus the reference electrode, and if you should be able to create a backbone that's tethered to the gold electrode, and then you have your template embedded in the middle of it. And I just go back up. And the more times you cycle with the CV, essentially the thicker your MIP layer becomes. And so here we have a MIP layer which has been created with the template, but now the template's been extracted. So when you add, let's say, the analyte back in, the signal changes. And we compared it here, so before and after, before and after, before and after. I should have said this much more clearly, and I didn't say this, but I want to give credit to Madalex. Madalex is a sister company to Zimmer Peacock in France, and I didn't say it very clearly at the beginning, but this is these slides were prepared by Madalex, so I just want to say thank you to Madalex and Yusuf there. But what we're showing here is that having formed a MIP, when we reintroduce the analyte now, the raw signal in terms of cyclophotometry changes. And so that's the kind of, and the degree of changing reflects the degree of binding. And that's what's happened here. They've used cyclophotometry to look at a range of concentrations. So they actually used charge, so area under the curve, versus ATZ, which I think is a pesticide. Here we are. And Hicham is saying, in my case, I use pyrrole. And it's interesting because I would agree with him. Pyrrole is actually, let's say, better. So what we're doing here is we're looking at charge of, I call it signal, but it's charge, and we're looking at that charge versus concentration, and we get kind of like a classic binding curve. Now that's what we get with cyclophotometry, and the limit of detection is something like 100 nanomolar. Now, if you go to square wave voltammetry, you actually increase, and here they've actually gone to square wave voltammetry, and they're just using the peak height. I suspect they could look at peak charge as well. But what they're demonstrating is that they can get down to about 10 to minus 9 molar, so 1 nanomolar of detection. So it just shows you that. How would I summarize this conversation so far? I think that MIPS are actually quite a versatile technology for sensing. A subdivision of that is MICP, molecular imprinted conducting polymers. It's quite easy to form molecular. Easy is a bad term. It's fairly straightforward to be able to form an MICP on a screen printed electrode. I think it is a good idea to use pyrroles and polypyrroles, and Hitcham is online is also concluded. I showed the example of thiophene, but I think thiophene sometimes require organic solvents, and it's not good to get into a product development where you have to use a lot of organic solvents. They're hard to handle in factories, they're flammable, they can be toxic to the users, and they can damage things like screen printed electrodes. And what I've now said is, having formed your MIP, you can use cyclophotometry to analyze that binding, or you can start using more, I wouldn't say exotic these days, but square wave voltammetry as well to also help you work on that limit detection. Now, I think this is quite a nice concept, and I would like to sort of maybe go over this at another date as well. But what's happening here is, you could complain that MIPS, they will bind to the analyte, but they might not have the specificity that you would have with an antibody, or they might not have the specificity that you'd have with an enzyme. I mean, antibodies and enzymes, they essentially come from a natural source. You could argue there's been sort of billions of years of evolution to get them to where they need to be. And now with MIP, we've only invented these things in the last kind of 20, 30 years. So, we're trying to imitate nature, but nature, at the moment, will always beat us. But this is quite a nice idea that, in fact, if you want to increase the specificity of a MIP sensor, you could have two working electrodes, one which is the MIP, which is the molecular imprinted pore in it, and then one which is the NIP, which is the sort of it has no pores in it. It's essentially, so you have one where you have you templated the conducting polymer, and one where you didn't template the conducting polymer. And so you should have a specific interaction on the MIP and a non-specific interaction on the NIP. And what you can do there is a difference between those two electrodes, and that's the source of your signal. So I know that's very theoretical, what I've sort of set out there, but I think that might be an interesting way of making MIPS even more specific by doing a subtraction of the non-specific signal by having a very similar working electrode, except where you didn't have the pores in the conducting polymer. Now, this has all been very theoretical, a lot of cartoons. I mean, Zimmer and Peacock, we want to commercialize everything. We want everyone else to commercialize their things. So the direction that we're going is to start helping people through the materials on the website and through the screen printed electrodes to actually do this on screen printed electrodes. There's really little point in doing MIPS on glassy disc electrodes. It's good for characterization and it's good for producing papers, but if you really want to make like low-cost sensors and low-cost sensors for water, you have to do it on a platform that can one day be commercialized. And so obviously, we're super biased at Zimmer Peacock, and we wanted to do it on our carbon electrodes or our gold electrodes. As time goes on, I'm going to talk about making MIPS more and more on our Hypervalue electrodes, because for me, the Hypervalue electrode is such a low-cost platform. I mean, we sell packs of 200, and each electrode in that pack is like 99 cents, so the whole pack's 198 euros. But that's starting to be the kind of price point that you need to have in order for a sensor to be used, for water analysis and stuff like that. So I would encourage everyone to try it on the Hypervalue electrodes. It's interesting because I'm just looking at Hitcham's comment here. He says that, that the MIP signal should always be more important than the NIP. And when you have a molecular imprinted sensor, you have maybe two sources of signal: specific binding and non-specific binding. So if you run a NIP, a non-imprinted polymer, next to the molecular imprinted polymer, and you do so, that will only have non-specific signal, and you should be able to extract the NIP signal from the MIP signal and really be left with a signal that's just the specific interaction. And just to re-say this, we're very interested in people actually obviously using a Hypervalue electrodes because we think the price point will make them commercially viable. And on our website as well, we're also just building up a selection of MIP backbones and then some functionalized monomers so that people can mix and match these monomers and monomers together in order to kind of make a MIP that's specific to their particular template. So in summary, first of all, thank you to AFTAB and HitJam for coming online. I know that HitJam in particular is actually interested in MIPS as well, so that I find it ironic that we're very interested in MIPS these days as well. I think MIPS is a good platform for making electrochemical biosensors. I really like them. They have been demonstrated to work in the literature, and there is an increasing commercial interest in MIPS as well, and here I am at ZP also interested in it. And we are increasing our range of reagents around this, and we're also then going to be sort of talking more about how to make MIPS on our screen printer electrodes. So I want to sort of summarize, and well, not summarize, I want to sort of wrap up now, because unfortunately we're in Germany this week. We're at a conference that's on a really big conference center called the Messe in Düsseldorf. In a normal year, there's probably like 150,000 people attend. This year, because of unfortunately COVID-19, there'll be about 40,000. But I'm going to wrap up now. I'm going to say thank you very much to the good guys who came online this morning. This video will get posted, and I will speak to some of you soon. And wish us good luck in the show today. And as I say, speak to you soon. All right. Cheers, HitJam, and thanks, AFTAB, and take care, guys. All right. Bye-bye.